Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Bliss with the California Budget and Policy Center, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's online panel discussion, Perspectives on Poverty. Last week, the U.S. Census Bureau released the latest state-level figures on poverty, income, economic hardship, and other factors in California, and it showed that even as California continues to rebound from the Great Recession, many Californians are still left behind by this recovery. We have more than 6 million Californians living in poverty, as well as including 2 million children. And sorry about that. And and even though most people at this point widely know that this tends to underestimate or understate the problem of poverty in our state, because given the high cost of living in California. So the official poverty measure, while showing economic challenges facing California, actually don't quite show the extent of economic hardship and challenges facing individuals, families, and communities across California. So for today's Google Hangout, we're going to be talking with an expert panel, not just about what these new data say about poverty in California, but also about how our state can be doing more to help families advance and to address economic hardship in our state. The panel today includes Alissa Anderson, Senior Policy Analyst here at the California Budget and Policy Center, Jessica Bartholow, Legislative Advocate for the Western Center on Law and Poverty, José Padilla, who is the Executive Director of California Rural Legal Assistance, and John Zerolnick, Research Director with LAANE in Los Angeles. And to get things started, I wanted to just have each of our panelists talk a little bit about their organization and their role in helping to address poverty in California. And for that, we'll begin with José Padilla. José?
Thank you, Steve. CRLA is one of 11 legal aids that are funded by the federal government to provide civil legal services to the rural poor here in California. We grew out of the 1960s war on poverty. So next year we celebrate 50 years of civil legal aid to rural Californians. We operate through a network of 18 neighborhood offices that run from the border up the Central Coast, Central Valley, and as far north of Sacramento, Marysville area. We serve through a network workforce of 55 lawyers. We have 30 paralegals who do paralegal and outreach work in our places of service. And in terms of the services that we provide we're prioritized in housing, eviction defense, housing discrimination, foreclosure work, employment work, where we work with unpaid wages, working minimum wage work, sexual harassment in the workplace. We do rural education, we do rural health and environmental justice, and public benefits. And just to end, we have, in our rural areas, in the 26 counties we serve, we have 750,000 rural poor. Just to put it in context, we have more rural poor in our areas than about 24 states in the country. And finally, I'll say that about a third of our clients are going to be farm workers. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much for that, José. And next we want to go to Jessica Bartholow with the Western Center. Jessica?
Thank you, Stephen. This is Jessica Bartholow. I'm with the Western Center on Law and Poverty's Sacramento office. We are a statewide organization that provides support services to legal services like CRLA throughout the state of California. And we also have a Sacramento shop in which we advocate here at the Capitol for policies, both through administrative advocacy but also through legislative advocacy to help people who are low income in California and on behalf of them. And finally, we file class action lawsuits when the laws that are enacted are not followed by either federal, state, or local municipal governments or other actors. We are a real proud partner of the center, the California Budget Center, and really happy to be here, and thank you for hosting the Google Chat.
Thank you, Jess. We're happy to, and thanks for being with us. Next, we're going to go to John Zerolnick, Research Director with LAANE in Los Angeles. John?
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. John Zerolnick with LAANE, the LA Alliance for a New Economy. We're a policy and research advocacy organization. For about 20 years, over 20 years now, we've been working to pass policies that foster creation of good quality jobs. Most of our work is here at the local level, but we're part of the Partnership for Working Families, an umbrella organization of 17 similar groups across the country, including 6 up and down California. We work very closely with workers and their unions, environmentalists, community groups, and small businesses. We currently have several ongoing campaigns in a number of different industries, hotels and hospitality, ports and goods movement, waste and recycling, grocery and retail, utilities and energy efficiency, transit manufacturing, and of course, minimum wage.
Thank you, John. And then finally, Alissa Anderson, Senior Policy Analyst here at the Budget Center. Alissa?
The goal of trying to create a state where, I'm sorry, I just realized I was muted. Let me start over. The Budget Center conducts public policy research and analyses with the goal of trying to create a state where everyone can fully contribute to our economy and our communities. And a large part of our work is looking at policies to broaden economic security and help more people advance economically. So this past year, for example, we did a lot of work looking at ways that California could create a new tax credit for working families, a state earned income tax credit, which we might talk about more today. We also look at job and wage trends both at the state and regional level, and look, for example, at how decades of wage stagnation and widening income gaps affect people in California. And we recently launched a new initiative to take a look at policies to reduce poverty in California. This is supported through the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in DC. And as part of that work, we've produced a few analyses to really create greater awareness of poverty in the state, to dispel common myths about poverty. And we're trying a number of new things to sort of broaden the discussion about poverty. Some people watching may have participated in or seen our Twitter chat last week to talk about the new Census poverty data. And the Google Hangout today is also part of our effort to try to broaden the conversation and go a little bit deeper into some of the issues, because we think it's really important that more people better understand the causes and consequences of poverty and recognize that there are specific policy choices we can make to broaden economic opportunity in California.
Great. Thank you, Alissa. And we mentioned a couple times that we really hope that this will be a discussion, and that involves not just the panelists, but also those of you watching on YouTube. So we do invite you to submit any questions you'd like us to pose to the panelists. You could do that either directly in the comments field that's below the YouTube window that you're likely watching this on. So right below the YouTube screen where we're streaming this, there's a comment section where you're welcome to provide some questions to us to pose to the panelists as we get into the Q&A section of the Hangout later. Or feel free, if you prefer, to just email us directly at the Budget Center. You can email us at contact@calbudgetcenter.org, and I'll give that email out again before we go to Q&A, but that's contact@calbudgetcenter.org. But we want to start with some questions for our panelists. And the first question is, what do you think is, just to put this in some context, what do you think is the most important thing that people need to understand about poverty? And Jess, let's start with you for this one.
You know, I think from my point of view, I'm an expert in policy related to poverty here in Sacramento, but I'm also an expert as somebody who experienced poverty as a child and as a young woman. And I think the most important thing for people to know about poverty is that it has a long-lasting impact, that the reach of poverty goes well beyond a child's experience with hunger or a family's experience with homelessness, and impacts their lives in many ways into their future. And in fact, research that's been released just in the last half a decade has shown that hunger experienced as a child can be just as detrimental as when they're in utero as intrauterine exposure to cocaine. And so if you think about hunger and malnutrition of a pregnant woman having the same negative impact as intrauterine exposure to cocaine, this is a serious public health threat and health threat to people who experience it. Children who experience even one hunger one time in their life as a child can have long-lasting consequences for their developmental behavior, development, their academics. They have less likelihood to graduate from high school, go into college, and in the end, exit poverty. It's a very human experience and can be detrimental in many, many ways. And I think that, for me, I think that that's the most important thing for people to know about poverty. When we're working on it, we are working to keep people from experiencing hunger and homelessness and indignities for today, but also to help strengthen all of us for our future economy.
Thanks, Jess. So, an important reminder to keep sort of the policy frame, but also very much the kind of human, individual, and family level frame in mind as well. Other thoughts from the panelists in terms of the most important thing people need to know about or understand about poverty in California?
Well, I mean, this is John at LAANE. I think it is critically important that folks understand that most people who show up as poor in these data are in fact working. But people don't get enough hours, wages are too low, and wage theft is pervasive. And each one of those three plays an important role. I mean, take a look at port truck drivers. These are drivers who move goods to and from the ports in California. We have about 12,000 of them here in Southern California. There's another 2,000 of these drivers up in Oakland. Trucking companies refer to these workers as independent contractors, independent businesses, and they claim that these folks bring in $100,000 a year. That sounds like success, not poverty. In reality, these are misclassified workers, and when you call someone an independent contractor rather than an employee, this allows the trucking companies to avoid paying taxes, benefits. It deprives workers from accessing employment, disability, prevents workers from organizing to improve conditions. And so after they finish paying all of the trucking companies' expenses, most of these guys are taking home about $30,000 a year. And that's for 60 hours of work a week on average. So these are effectively, in a lot of cases, sub-minimum wage jobs, and so it's important, to kind of push through the first level of numbers and understand what's going on in a deeper way.
Steve, I wanted to add, at least from the perspective of rural poverty and what might make what people should understand. One of them is exactly what John said. That is, the rural counties that we're in and the rural poor are working poor. And when you find that both spouses are working, you will find that even with two salaries, they still remain poor. As is expected, rural poverty is caused by the dominant employment sector, which is agriculture. I've seen some research that says that for every ag job that's created, a half a person is going to end up in poverty. So it is that sector that's a structural issue that people should know that exists because a $44 billion industry uses a workforce that is poor, highly immigrant, work only part-time, not full-time, and again, but it's a working poverty. It's not welfare because of a characteristic being immigrant, that many of them cannot even access a safety net. So you're talking about a different kind of a poverty where access is very different than you will find in a lot of parts of the urban poor. The other part of it is that also because of the nature of agriculture and because most of those jobs are part-time, and seasonal, you will find higher unemployment rates in rural California, meaning that people need the social safety net through unemployment, but many of them cannot access it, and so it creates a different kind of a poverty. And I just wanted to add those. points about rural poverty.
These are great points, and I wanted to jump in as well. I think the first thing that people need to understand about poverty is that it's a problem that we can address, that it's largely reflecting our policy choices, and I think that we need to do a lot more work to make sure that people understand that policies matter. There was a PPIC poll from last year that I found really interesting that showed that most people in California think that poverty is a big problem, but fewer than half think that public policies can do much about it. And actually, more than 1 in 4 likely voters said that they didn't think public policy could do anything or very little to address poverty. And so I think we need to do more to show that policies matter. We have lots of evidence we can point to. For example, we know that if you look at just how many people are living in poverty just based on how much they earn, the U.S. ranks sort of average compared to other rich nations. But once you factor in how the tax system can help people keep more of their earnings, how public supports can help make sure that more people can afford food and housing and so forth, poverty in other rich nations is much lower, and the U.S. actually has the highest poverty rate among wealthy nations. So it's clear indication that our policies matter, and our policies aren't doing as much here to make sure that families can adequately support themselves. And so I think part of the problem is people tend to view poverty as an individual problem, and I think we need to point to the ways in which access to opportunity really matters. That where you live, for example, really determines what kinds of opportunities you have. We know from research that kids who grow up in places where poverty is highly concentrated, where maybe a third or more of their neighbors are living in poverty, have worse outcomes. And that's because these places tend not to have good jobs or good schools. And we know from research that when kids are able to move to places where there are greater opportunities, that their outcomes improve. So it shows that our policy choices really matter. And so I think it's important for people to recognize opportunity is not equitably distributed, that reflects policy choices, is part of why poverty persists, and that we can make different policy choices to make sure that everyone does have the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Thank you. Thank you for all those comments. I wanted to follow up on that briefly with a question to José, just to pick up on Alyssa's point about sort of the extent to which communities are sort of disproportionately or not equitably impacted by poverty. And in particular, when you look at the county poverty rates in California historically, there's many, poverty is widespread in our state, but you will often typically see that in the Central Valley and the rural areas, that poverty is well above the the statewide average of about 16%. And so, José, I know that's probably something that you're seeing in your work every day, and I just want to see if you could just reflect a little bit on some of the sort of community levels impacts that you're seeing of poverty in rural California, what that means for rural communities, and whether you've seen any sort of change or dynamic in that at all over the last 5 to 10 years in rural parts of our state.
Well, in thinking about those higher unemployment rates. I'm sorry, the higher poverty rates. Again, it's because of what was said a little earlier. There are a lot of structural obstacles in rural California, rural generally. The job opportunities aren't there. The training opportunities that the young adults who are in poverty, who come from poverty families, because as mentioned, it's generational, they have less access to schools, technical schools. So the resource disparity is clearly an impact. And similarly, when you have the dominant job creator being agriculture, or the dominant job creator being state prisons, they're going to be very few who can access those jobs that will create the middle class. And so for me, when you have that kind of disparity in access to resources that will allow you to take advantage of the opportunities that were mentioned, that will keep people in poverty. You will keep those high poverty rates there. Again, rural schools, the disparity in resources in rural schools, that's a whole other area that I think has been studied but not studied enough. And so education, access to education will be different in rural places and rural schools. I know that one of the things that I didn't mention earlier, rural poverty is highly ethnic. 60% of the rural poor that we serve will be Latino. And it's all to say that the outcomes of the schools when it comes to the Latino community, very, very disparate. High school graduation rates are improving, but the dropout rate in rural for Latinos and African Americans continues to be horrendous. And so to the extent that the schools in rural places continue to fail, you will continue to have generational poverty because that access is not there. And so then what happens is the suffering is different. People had talked about the recession that we're getting out of. There is the foreclosure problem as an example of the recession problem. You know, some of the biggest and most disparate impacts of foreclosure were in rural counties. When I looked at 4 or 5 years ago, when you looked at the 10 worst areas that suffered from foreclosure, out of those 10 worst of the state, I had offices in 5 of those counties, in 5 of those metropolitan, I guess they call them statistical areas. And so, but people say, well, we've gotten over the foreclosure crisis. No, we have not. And so what happens is that geography and place means that people will suffer differently in some of those places. And I was just giving you the example of the foreclosure crisis that people say has ended. It hasn't ended in rural California, and the impacts continue there. More recently, in the last 5 years, we've seen the environmental impact that we all talk about when we talk about the drought. I don't know how many jobs have been lost in other places due to the problem that we're having there, but in rural California, in a couple of counties, you're talking about 18, 20,000 jobs having been lost. And now that people are talking about that environmental impact, then people start looking at the depth of deep poverty. People might be shocked to find out that one of the things in rural California is folks that we serve in many of my counties do not even have access to clean water. You're talking about potable water. You're talking about communities in the Central Valley, about maybe 500,000 people in 200 different communities. They send their kids off to school, and their schools cannot provide clean water out of that faucet. If you saw a recent article in The Nation talking about the water crisis, and there was a picture there of a woman in East Porterville walking with a little jug of a plastic bottle of water, the rural poor that we serve, in addition to barely being able to put food on the table, have to buy bottled water for their kids when they send them off to school. Talking about people who can't afford that, and yet they pay for water in those places, and they cannot get clean water. And that's happened in the Central Valley. You're talking about Riverside County and some of the worst communities around Coachella and in India, in some of those areas, 45 minutes out of Palm Springs, same thing. People paying for water, and it's poisoned. And so there are issues that are starting to surface because we're starting to pay more and more attention. And in rural California, again, over the last 5 years, these things about the recession impacts, the impacts of the drought, etc., it's being suffered differently in rural California. And I guess there's sort of some of the anecdotal things that I just wanted to mention in response.
Thank you, Jose. And your reply sort of draws together a lot of the different elements of poverty and economic hardship in California, the extent to which some of the underlying causes are, employment, infrastructure, education, access to various types of resources and supports. And so I guess what that leads to is sort of given all these various underlying causes and sort of the broad foundation of poverty, I guess the question for this group I wanted to put out there is can we significantly reduce poverty in California? Is that a viable goal?
I can jump in. I definitely think we can significantly reduce poverty in California. It's certainly not a question of resources. We have one of the largest economies in the world. We're home to incredible prosperity. And it's not a question of having the policy tools. We know what works. We know that our existing policies actually do a lot to reduce economic hardship. We know that almost 5 million Californians are lifted above the poverty line because of things like food assistance that help people buy groceries, unemployment insurance that help families make ends meet while they look for jobs, tax credits for working families. And so, in part, reducing poverty is a matter of strengthening those existing policies. We also know that we can reduce poverty because we've significantly reduced poverty in the past. I think one of the best examples is the fact that our nation cut poverty among seniors by over half in a relatively short period of time by making greater investments in Social Security. I think what's missing is that we don't have a broader commitment to the goal of reducing poverty. I think it really needs to be a key state priority. And I think we can see evidence from elsewhere when it is a priority, a lot of progress can be made. The UK, for example, set a goal of ending child poverty. And during the first 5 years when they were most committed to that goal, they made quite a bit of progress lifting kids out of poverty. But I think what's different about their experience that we can learn for here is that there was not only widespread concern about poverty among the public, but there was sort of this general understanding that the government could and should address poverty. And I think that's where we need to do work here. I referenced the poll earlier where a lot of people don't see a role for public policy. And so I think we need to make the case that it's a logical extension of government's role to invest in policies that broaden economic opportunity and reduce economic hardship in our state.
Thank you. Other thoughts on whether this is, what your thoughts on the prospects of significantly reducing poverty in California?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I agree with Alissa. We not only can significantly reduce poverty, we have to. We have a growingly unequal community of people here in the state. We have the largest number of children living in poverty. We have over 500,000 families who have children and are homeless. What José said before about the vacancy rates among rentals, that's leaving a lot of families outside of the ability to afford a rental, a home to rent, even when those families are working. And in fact, PPIC, according to PPIC, nearly 80% of low-income Californians have somebody in the house that is working. So we have a number of policies here that have been proposed in the state legislature. Many of them we're still struggling to get through that would reduce the number of people who are working and poor, right? California has about 800,000 people who are minimum wage earners in the state of California. All of those people could be earning more if we had a higher state minimum wage, and when we do pass local minimum wages that are increased. If we were able to secure more stable schedules for those workers and more full-time work for those workers, they would certainly fall out of the population of people who were experiencing poverty. And from Western Center on Poverty's point of view, we are working to strengthen the safety net. So things like making sure that the CalWorks program, our state TANF Temporary Aid to Needy Families program, doesn't trap families in deep poverty. Right now, the exit point for that program is below the poverty line, and most families live below half of the federal poverty line. That's called deep poverty, and that's a very dangerous place for the children to live and families to live, and it's very hard to escape from. These are all, there are several proposals to help reduce the opportunity that people are living in poverty and increase the likelihood that people living in poverty can escape it. And there's no lack of information on that line.
So
if I can jump in.
Go ahead. I was just going to jump in. This might have been the issue that John was potentially going to raise. One of the issues that always comes up when we talk about really making an impact on addressing poverty in California, in addition to some of those that Jessica and Alissa had just mentioned, and some of the other issues touched on earlier, is that for a lot of families, it's the cost of housing is a huge impediment to getting by and to advancing economically. I know, John, in Los Angeles, LAANE has done some work focused in particular on the outsized impact that high housing costs has on families in your area. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Earlier this year, UCLA researchers came out with a new analysis which found LA to be, I believe, the least affordable housing city, at least for renters in the U.S. You need to make about $34 an hour just to afford the average apartment in LA. The fundamental problems, of course, are low wages and high housing costs, but we did some new research this year that looked at the role that Airbnb and other short-term rental companies are contributing to housing unaffordability. We found that the recent explosion in short-term rental activity is realigning incentives for property owners to convert long-term housing for residents into short-term housing for tourists. We have over 23,000 short-term rental units in LA. Most of them represent commercial activity rather than true sharing, the sort of sharing that these sites try to paint themselves as. Based on Airbnb's own numbers, we've estimated that short-term rental companies are driving up housing costs for renters in the city of LA by over $464 million annually. And these sites are taking 11 housing units off the market per day. This accounts for about 63% of all new housing construction. So we need to get a handle on some of the perverse effects of Airbnb and some of the other short-term rental operators. We need to protect true sharing, but we also need to put an end to the commercial activity that dominates the market and makes housing increasingly out of reach for working people.
Thank you, John. And to pick up on that, so you've highlighted in your discussion of housing in Los Angeles a number of potential policy tools that could be used to help families get by in advance, and there was some reference made to other options that we have, both at the state level and also locally, to really take have an effect on addressing poverty or mitigating its impacts. So I want to open it up a little bit now, just for the panelists to talk about what you think would be some of the key ways, whatever they might be, public policy changes or other types of approaches, to really reducing poverty in California.
So Western Center on Law and Poverty has been working with partners across the state, many very diverse partners, to help end a policy called the Maximum Family Grant. This policy denies basic needs assistance to children who are born into poverty based on how they were conceived. We're one of the only states to have this policy, and certainly one of the few in the western part of the country. This, we believe, is one of the most important steps forward for families who are living in poverty, and especially in deep poverty, to prevent lost future opportunities for children living in deep poverty, to make sure that they're not denied basic needs assistance from day one, to prevent things like unmet diaper needs or homelessness among these families. So the Maximum Family Grant repeal is a policy that has bipartisan support. It's one of the only policies in the state legislature that has support from Planned Parenthood and the Catholic Diocese. Has very diverse support all the way across California. And SB 23 by Senator Holly Mitchell would achieve that goal. We are still looking for people to come on and support, and trying to convince the governor that this policy change is the right one for California. that's just one example of the host of policies that are out there. We're also trying to make sure that when families who are working and poor, that they have fewer chances to fall into poverty. So things like paid family leave. There's a bill sitting on the governor's desk today, SB 406, by Senator Jackson, which would help make sure that people can take a little time off to care for their extended family, like their aunts or their sisters. And there's AB 908, a bill that's still on the Assembly floor and hopefully will come up next year by Member Gomez, which would make sure that low-income workers have the same access, or at least better access, to paid family leave when they have to take care of their loved ones. And we're looking for schedule fairness. We have a website people can go to see what that campaign looks like. It's schedulefairness.com. And what we're looking for there is just a little advance notice for low-income workers in the retail industry, so that they know when their schedule is going to be and they can plan their second job around that, or opportunities for education and training to get themselves, to build their way out of poverty. I always say, people are always looking for policies that help lift families out of poverty, but I think that that's a misnomer, this lifting out of poverty somebody else. If you are to exit poverty, you do it you do it in large part by yourself, with the support of good programs and community that are strong. But you have to scrape and crawl your way out, and it's our job to make sure that people have the tools to do that.
Steve, maybe I can chime in a little bit, sort of from my perspective about some things that could change. It was already said about the minimum wage, and I totally agree that at some point we have to buy into the idea that if our poor are working poor, then we owe them the ability to work at the minimum wage that will keep them out of poverty. I think in the 50s, when we were, as a federal government, supporting the idea of a middle class, all those folks coming out of World War II and the Korean War, that's what the minimum wage was about. It was set at a level where the folks who were working minimum wage were not in poverty. And yet we today find people working minimum wage and remain in poverty. That has to conceptually change. And we're hearing the messaging about how we, in these elections that are coming up, the politicians should be addressing the issue of the support for the middle class. To me, that's where it starts. That's a place where it starts. We have the minimum wage that keeps supporting a middle class, and right now it's not. There are also, in terms of changes, two things. One is, I know that recently, when the federal government took that incredible step through ACA, the Affordable Care Act, there were gaps in California. Many rural poor, many immigrant poor not having access. Yet there was the wherewithal and the political will to be able to fill in where the federal government had failed to reach our people, our residents in the state. That notion of us as a state being able to fill in where the federal government does not requires the kinds of legislation that were mentioned by Jessica, where if the Fed doesn't do it, we will take care of it to the state legislature. I want to say one final thing about education. We all know that the investment in education is critical. We know that Proposition 30 that was passed had an incredible impact in education in the state of California. 5 years ago or so, we were, ranked something like 50th or 40th, 8th or 49th in the amount of money we spent per pupil in our schools. That is an outrage. Proposition 30 put us now to around 29th, 30th. But if we're going to continue to invest in education, when the benefits of Proposition 30 run out, and it's going to, apparently it ends, it has an ending date, we have to step in, and once we see what the gains have been, and the research and the messaging has to show what the gains have been, well, we have to maintain them legislatively. because I think that it's not enough to see annual gains or gains over 1 or 2 years, and then all of a sudden we know why the gains were there, because we did invest in education, that we need to then maintain those. And how do you maintain those? Through legislative proposals and through the legislators who are there and do believe in these things. And so I think education is one of those areas where we must continue to see that policy does matter, as Alissa said, and we need to continue to invest in that long-term solution to education, because we know that many of us here, from personal stories, know that we left poverty because we were given the chance to go to school. And that's happened in my family. My grandparents were farm workers. They were poor. My father was a migrant farm worker. He and his family suffered through poverty. But when my father was able to leave those fields, he was then able to provide us with a stable place to live and then allowed us to go to school. And because there were the federal support for the kind of education that we were given, people like me were able to leave those rural high schools and go to places like the Stanfords and the Berkeleys, and that wherewithal has to continue for those next generation, and the investment in education is critical to that.
I'd like to, all right, go ahead, Alissa.
Oh, okay. I just want to add to a few of the things that have already been said. I think in terms of education, I think certainly we do need investments in education to broaden opportunities for children. And I would add that I think it's really critical to invest in education during the first few years of kids' lives. We know that the first few years of kids' lives are critical for development, and we know that kids from low-income families oftentimes show up in kindergarten already trailing well behind their higher-income peers. And I think that largely reflects a lack of opportunities early in life. Oftentimes they don't have access to high-quality childcare or preschool. If your parents are working multiple jobs or working the night shift, they might not be around as much to spend as much time with you reading, playing educational games, and so forth. And so I think we need much greater investments in education and in early education as well. Also, to pick back up on, we've talked a lot about the fact that most families in poverty are working. We certainly need policies to make sure that families can earn enough to support themselves. We've talked about the minimum wage. I'd add that I think we also need California to promote the state's new tax credit for working families, the earned income tax credit, together with promoting the federal earned income tax credit that the state credit is modeled after. The state credit has the potential to boost very low earning families' incomes by as much as 75% when combined with the federal credit. But really the key to its success is going to be making sure that everyone who's eligible for the credit learns about it, because California's credit's targeted to people with very, very low earnings, who we think many of whom probably aren't required to file personal income taxes and might not be familiar with how to benefit from the credit. And I think California can also look at ways of expanding this tax credit over time, because unlike other states' credits, it targets a relatively small number of people, again with very low earnings, so there's a lot of room to expand it so that more people benefit. And I would just add quickly, because I want to make sure John has time to speak as well, that we also need to look at policies that help families afford the basics. I think childcare is really critical. We know that because of deep state budget cuts, that a lot of families lost access to affordable childcare. And I'd also add food assistance as well, that I think a key problem is that there are a lot of people who are struggling to put food on the table who are not accessing CalFresh food assistance. And we know that it's a proven tool for lifting families out of poverty, but California could do more to broaden its reach.
We heard about how the state can pick up on policies, places where the feds leave off, and I would want to push that a step further and talk about the role for municipalities and local governments to fill in gaps where the state leaves off, which is not to take anything away from the critical policies that we have heard about and need to be pushing for and supporting, whether that's tax policy, education policy, scheduling, social safety net, but there's a critical role for local governments. And in a lot of cases, it's just a question of political will. What we're really talking about in a lot of cases is getting people not into jobs, getting people into good jobs, getting to people into jobs that are family sustaining. And yes, minimum wage. Here in LA, we're going to get to $15 an hour by 2020, and that's important. But we need to think not just about the number, whether it's 15 or whatever. We need to think about enforcement. We need to think about sick days. We need to think about indexing. There's a lot of nuance when it comes to making sure a minimum wage lifts people up, and so that's one way that a municipality can act. There's another way that I think my computer just died.
He looks frozen to me. If it's you, Jose, you're on.
To do so.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll let, it looks like John might have lost John there for a second, but we'll give him a chance to get back on. In the meantime, I wanted to actually go to one of our questions and remind people that we're taking questions via YouTube or via email. So we got about 15 minutes or so to go in the session, and you can submit questions either in the comment section on YouTube, or you can submit questions to us via email directly at contact@calbudgetcenter.org. And I want to go to a question actually that we received from one of our viewers, and this kind of goes to the earnings question and the good jobs question. The issue of wage theft, any sense of, we know it's a problem and it's somewhat prevalent, any sense of the role that wage theft, or I should say preventing wage theft, could play in addressing economic insecurity in California?
You want to take that, Jose? Or, I would assume that wage theft is, no, he doesn't want to take it. I do, I could say that here, I've been learning a little bit actually on this issue as there's been a more awareness about it here in California at the legislature. And actually a piece of legislation that has been passed, authored by Senate Speaker De Leon, has gone down to the governor's desk to try to address this issue. Obviously workers who have little workplace protection and are marginalized are more likely to have wage theft impacts on their take-home pay. And from what I've learned, the recourses for them to be able to collect on unpaid wages are not as strong as they should be.
Thanks. And then the other question I wanted to make sure we got into the mix, there was some discussion a little while ago about food assistance and addressing poverty, and addressing hunger in particular as one aspect of poverty. And one question that came in via YouTube was concerned the fact that there are a large number of seniors who face the challenge of being low income, but because they receive SSI, as well as most likely some Social Security, but mostly SSI benefits, they're not eligible for CalFresh, or as we call food stamps or SNAP in California. And at the same time, they're, for whatever reason, not able to access food services or meals through their local food bank, whether due to transportation issues or other issues. Anything, Jess, I know you've done some work on this in terms of the issue of senior hunger and the way that the interplay of SSI and CalFresh benefits might be strengthened or looked at.
Yeah, sure. So, senior hunger is of growing concern, not just in California, but across the country. This is not only just because the numbers of people who are elderly is growing, but also because the incomes that they have as they grow old have been reduced or in jeopardy. So for example, here in California, the Supplemental Security Income, SSI, is an income that people receive when they're elderly or disabled and haven't had enough earnings in their lifetime to qualify for a higher level of Social Security. And as a result, they get a little bit of supplement through this benefit amount. It still keeps them pretty far below the poverty line, however. And many people, especially with the rent so high as they are unable to meet their basic food needs. One might say, well, why can't they just go down to the soup kitchen or to the food pantry? But remember that people who receive SSI are people who are older and people who have disabilities. And that prevents them from getting out of their homes. It prevents them from being able to do something as simple as carry a bag of food home with them on a bus, or being able to open a can or a jar by themselves. And so preparing food is difficult if they were to bring food home from a food pantry that's usually non-perishable food, and so comes in cans and jars. Additionally, going to soup kitchens can be a bit of a challenge. A lot of people who are on SSI have diet restrictions, like like diabetes or high blood pressure that prevents them from eating the same foods that other people might be able to eat with abandon. But also, increasingly, people who are very poor have poor dental health. We don't have full dental insurance, Denti-Cal, for low-income adults here in California, and as a result, people don't have teeth, or their teeth health is is not very good, and so it prevents them from being able to chew. Things that a lot of us might take for granted. If you've never had the inability to chew your food, you might not realize that that's something people have to take into consideration. Additionally, soup kitchens and food pantries, they're struggling to keep food on the shelves and food in the pots. They're really dependent on donations, and it's not a sure thing when the lines get long that you'll get to the end of it and there'll be food for you. Especially when there are questions about the government safety net programs not serving everybody. So for SSI recipients here in California, we are the only state in the country where these adults who are elderly or disabled are ineligible for CalFresh. The reasoning for that is long and long history. But I guess to end with saying that I do believe that it is a policy that we should be looking into here in California. I know that that in addition to increasing the SSI, we cut the COLA during the recession. We cut benefits from this program during the recession, and there's no reason at all why we should be putting money away in our savings account for the state of California without helping make sure that our most vulnerable neighbors are taken care of and can eat and stay housed.
Okay, thank you. We're starting to get a number of questions coming in from viewers, which we appreciate. So I want to stay on the questions for a moment here because we have some really some interesting ones and some sort of kind of wide-ranging in their focus. So I want to shift a little bit now to this comes back a little bit to the idea of how do you prepare people not just for jobs but for good jobs. And so there's been some comments already about the importance of education, early childhood, post-secondary. Anything though, kind of taking that a step further in terms of job training approaches that might be worth either expanding or looking into, or whether there are any models. So the question really gets at what can we be doing from a job training standpoint in California to help people not just get jobs but get good jobs.
One thing that we've done in LA is we've tried to create pathways to good jobs, particularly to communities that have been disadvantaged that don't often have those pathways. So we worked with Metro and a number of other agencies to create a construction careers policy that is going to, when Metro and the Port of LA and a CRA when we had a CRA and other agencies that spend a lot of money to build stuff, that they should be hiring people from the communities, and that this through the creation of what's called the UPCT, which I will, if you ask me what that stands for, I'll probably screw it up, but it's a new classification of worker to create that pathway to move people who didn't have access to these jobs into family-sustaining jobs. And this requires bringing everyone to the table, but then it does create a win-win.
Thanks, John. Another question that came in a little bit, not so much along the sort of employment line, but kind of switching back a little bit to just how we define poverty in California and also federally. And the question was whether the way that we define or measure poverty federally or in California, does that in any way present barriers to how we actually address it? Now, we talked earlier at the outset about how the federal poverty line actually understates poverty, that the census alternative measure, the supplemental poverty measure, actually is a better look at economic well-being in the state. So it's already fairly well acknowledged that just the FPL itself, the federal poverty line itself, is probably understates, or not probably, but understates the level of poverty in California. But I want to put the more general question out to the group as to whether how we measure it or how we assess poverty federally or in California, how does that get in the way of us actually addressing poverty in our state?
Well, I think it's certainly, as you mentioned, when you look at the supplemental poverty measure, which factors in our high cost of living, you can see that poverty is a much bigger problem in California. And I think it does impact how we think about the problem because it highlights the fact that housing costs are really a critical reason why a lot of people are struggling to make ends meet. So I think when you're just looking at the official poverty measure, you're just looking at how much people earn, basically. And certainly earnings and low-wage jobs are a big problem. But when you factor in the high cost of living, that's an issue that needs to be addressed as well. And we didn't really talk much about that during our policy discussion, but I think we absolutely need to look at ways to increase affordable housing and other ways to help people be able to afford skyrocketing rents in many parts of our state.
If I could just add in here, because there is a policy angle to this, Assembly Joint Resolution 22 was authored by Assemblymember Kevin Mullen and signed by the governor just last week, which calls on policymakers to be looking at the supplemental poverty line as a way to establish policy. And in fact, this year, we worked on a bill authored by Senator Wachowski, which addresses wage garnishment for working poor. And working with Assemblywoman Garcia and others in the Assembly, we used the supplemental poverty line as a measure to help us identify a good cutting off point for the place in which the bill would help the working poor. And so if people don't know about the supplemental poverty line, there is a California-specific one that was developed for California by Stanford and working with PPIC and others. And I would encourage us all to look for that.
Yeah, and another thing that I would add is that by using the supplemental poverty measure, which factors in how non-cash public supports help families make ends meet, things like food assistance, housing assistance, it allows us to better understand how our policy choices affect poverty, so we can actually measure the impact of specific policies, and that can help to inform our policy choices.
And following off of José's lead, in which he said, today we have to call on federal policy, not just state policy. I want to point out that the White House just declared that broadband and internet access should be among the essential package of utilities that Americans need, and that should trickle into the consideration of costs of living when we determine benefits and benefit support. And also the CalFresh program here in California, our food assistance program known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program federally, that program uses a really outdated housing standard for its excess housing costs. And it's just unheard of to me that that Congress wouldn't consider changing that or increasing it, especially in a state like California.
Thank you. So we're coming up on 3 o'clock, and I want to, as much as possible, keep us to our hour time frame. We're going to probably go a couple minutes over, but I think that's okay. So whoever wants to stick around from our viewers, you're welcome to do so, of course. I do want to close by coming back to the question of political will, which has been mentioned a couple of times, the importance of, that we have things we know work, and it's about building, the support, the public support, and the policymaker support for putting these sort of changes and policies into place. So I want to just have just some brief remarks from the panelists about, what is the most critical thing we could be doing sort of as a state and as a community of people interested in addressing poverty to build that political will for really putting in place the changes that would address poverty in our state.
I'd be happy to start off. I think going back to the way Jessica started at the beginning of our discussion, I think what would help is highlighting the research that shows the consequences of allowing poverty to persist. We know that poverty has a human cost and an economic cost. It really means lost human potential, and that kids who grow up in poverty just don't have a fair shot to reach their full potential. And I think it's important for us to emphasize that, sorry, I lost my train of thought there, that, our future really depends on kids who were born and raised in California and who are a product of how much our state invests in their education and their health and their well-being. And so reducing poverty really benefits all of us.
I wanted to just make a comment about the political will. I've always said when I speak that poverty is political because the politician at the federal level, at the state level, at the municipal level, as was mentioned earlier by John, they can step in and use whatever authority within their space to make a difference. And so, in the ways that people said, by changing the minimum wage to make it a livable wage, you can change poverty through that politic. But at the same time, the obligation is actually individual. I tell my attorneys and my paralegals, when I try to cheerlead them, I will say that we may not be able to change the world, and we can save poverty in the world, but we sure as blank can change our corner of it. And that means that the will for this, because we understand it's political, I think, means that it's not only our politicians that we look to, it's that we have to hold them accountable. And that to the extent that, and I don't care, what part, where you are in this, we're invested because it is our purpose in working to change poverty, to address poverty. But everybody in this state must feel that they are responsible for it. And so there has to be that political will. But unless there are those of us demanding that will be exercised, then the change is not going to happen. And I know those of you who are working legislatively that's what you do. But I know that those of us that are on the ground, we recently had some of our Triqui indigenous farm work. I didn't talk about that, but the fact that a quarter of agriculture is made up of indigenous farm workers. We recently had a leadership training where we trained some indigenous Triqui speakers who speak Triqui, to make them feel that even though they were immigrants, that they could go to Sacramento and speak to those legislators to change certain laws. And even they who are immigrant, who cannot vote, can go there and be that voice that brings to that politician the human story that then allows them to understand why they have to change, why they have to pass X law. And the point being that I think that the responsibility begins with the folks that we see every day in our work, and figuring out how we can have them feel that they also can hold their politicians responsible at that city council, whether it's in Los Angeles or the city council that's out there in Cuatro Puntos or LAANE, wherever it's at. So it's all to say that we have that politician there, the political will has to be there, and we have to be the ones that explain how that needs to be done with our clients right alongside making that safety demand.
I think with the idea that it's the type of thing that really involves all types of players, policymakers, organizations like ours, individuals, I think that's a good note to maybe leave this on for this Google Hangout for today. I do want to just end with a couple of quick comments. One is that we'll be doing more of these in the future at the Cal Budget Center. This topic itself, as you can see, a lot of great comments, but so much more we could have gotten into. So I'm sure we'll be talking more via this format about poverty and related issues. I can imagine us doing a separate discussion just about job training, about employment policy as well. So keep an eye out on calbudgetcenter.org, our website. We can also sign up for email announcements to keep up with all the latest, including event announcements. Also, just to note that via our YouTube channel, which we'll post a link to from our website, you'll be able to access a recording of this Google Hangout on video, so you can share it or rewatch snippets of it. I do want to just close by thanking our panelists for being with us today. Great commentary, great discussion, and a lot of insights into this very critical issue. I also just want to quickly thank the entire team at the Budget Center. Everyone had a hand in making this happen, and in particular, a shout out to Janice Yee, our unparalleled communications associate behind the scenes, making this all work as well as it did. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I'm Stephen Bliss with the Budget Center, and have a good afternoon.
Hi.